The desert air on the border has thickened with a silent, chilling new decree. A seismic shift in geopolitical power dynamics is rewriting the rules of human scrutiny. The unseen eyes that watched the shadows have been deliberately forced to turn away. Every whisper of humanitarian concern is now drowned out by the thunder of political will. The thin line of light separating oversight from absolute control has just vanished entirely. This isn't merely policy change, it is the deliberate construction of a hidden operational space. It begs the critical question, what darkness thrives when the world is asked to look elsewhere? The border has closed its window to the world, and the United States has endorsed the padlock. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the narrative, or comment below. What do you believe the governments are trying to hide in the silence? The official statements arrive like carefully crafted diplomatic shields, meant to deflect the immediate storm of international condemnation, yet simultaneously signaling an unwavering, coordinated stance between Washington and Mexico City. This unprecedented joint action, where the United States openly supports Mexico's sovereign decision to expel non-governmental foreign observers and international humanitarian monitors from key border zones, redefines the volatile landscape of North American security and migration control. The stated rationale, delivered with sterile precision by spokespeople from both nations, centers on issues of national security, the necessity of operational flexibility for enforcement agencies, and the perceived interference of external bodies in complex, delicate internal affairs. The essence of the diplomatic argument hinges on the claim that these observers, often affiliated with high-profile human rights organizations, and sometimes providing direct aid, were inadvertently or deliberately complicating critical law enforcement operations. Mexico's administration, asserting its constitutional right to manage its own territory, framed the move as a reclamation of sovereignty and a measure to streamline the ongoing security deployment against cartels and the control of unprecedented migratory flows. The U.S. swiftly aligned itself, portraying its support as a vital gesture of partnership, arguing that a unified front, free from what they term unnecessary external distractions, is essential to achieving complete operational control of the southern border, a key objective reiterated by the recent executive actions in Washington. This strategic alignment is a calculated risk, trading international goodwill and transparency for what both administrations view as short-term operational effectiveness and political expediency. The U.S. endorsement effectively legitimizes Mexico's aggressive maneuver, providing diplomatic cover against accusations of human rights negligence and shielding the Mexican government from punitive measures or public censure from the global community. By citing the need to combat powerful transnational criminal organizations and manage massive migrant encounters which reached critical peaks in recent fiscal years, prompting the declaration of a national emergency by the current administration, the two governments attempt to elevate the situation above simple humanitarian oversight, rebranding it as a high-stakes national defense posture requiring zero external interference. However, the reality on the ground is far more nuanced and tragically human than the carefully worded press releases suggest. The sudden, forced departure of humanitarian groups and observers creates an immediate and dangerous oversight vacuum, particularly in the most isolated and conflict-ridden border sectors. These international organizations were the crucial, independent third parties, meticulously documenting the grim realities of the migrant experience, the pervasive threat of kidnapping, extortion, and sexual assault by cartels and corrupt officials, the perilous conditions in makeshift migrant encampments, and critically monitoring the adherence to due process and non-refoulement principles under international law. Their daily presence, even when limited, served as a fragile deterrent against potential abuses of power by security forces on both sides of the boundary line. Without the immediate and visible pressure of foreign observers, security and immigration agents operate in an atmosphere of unchecked authority, where the potential for rights violations, excessive force, and the summary expulsion of vulnerable asylum seekers escalates dramatically. The silence that settles over the frontera is not one of peace, but a dangerous stillness, a lack of documented witness that historically precedes the gravest human tragedies in confined spaces of conflict and distress. This humanitarian oversight vacuum is directly linked to the controversial and ever-shifting U.S. border policies, such as the repeated invocation and suspension of restrictive measures like the Title 42 expulsions and the Migration Protection Protocols (MPP), or Remain in Mexico. The Mexican government's past and present willingness to accept the return of non-Mexican nationals. Under these American rules, a condition often obtained under the threat of crippling economic tariffs puts it in a legally and morally precarious position. The presence of international NGOs was often the only viable legal and physical lifeline for refugees caught in the crossfire, providing critical legal aid and ensuring some semblance of accountability for both countries regarding their obligations under the Refugee Convention and the Convention Against Torture. The removal of these protective witnesses raises immediate, urgent alarm bells among global human rights advocates, who fear that the border zones will become impenetrable black boxes where the already severe abuses become systematic and invisible. The lack of independent verification means that any official statistics or internal investigations, released by either the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, DHS, or Mexico's National Institute of Migration, INAIMI, will be met with profound skepticism, eroding the already fragile public trust in the integrity of border management practices. This deliberate opacity transforms the crisis from a matter of migration control into a deep crisis of international human rights and transparency, staining the democratic credentials of both North American partners. Diving into the geopolitical motivations reveals a complex web of internal political pressures and strategic interests that transcend simple border logistics. For the U.S. administration, the support for Mexico's expulsion of observers is fundamentally a move rooted in the intense domestic political climate, particularly the high-stakes political environment following recent elections. The focus is singularly on projecting an image of absolute, decisive control over the border, a central, non-negotiable policy goal that resonates with a significant portion of the electorate seeking immediate, visible deterrence to unauthorized crossings. The decision allows the U.S. to delegate the more contentious and internationally scrutinized aspects of deterrence, the direct handling of large groups of migrants, and the physical blocking of pathways to their Mexican counterpart, while simultaneously removing the persistent, critical reporting by non-state actors that often highlights the policy's humanitarian costs. This strategy effectively cleans up the public relations narrative, reducing the constant flow of negative visual evidence and first-hand accounts that challenge the official line of securing the nation. It is a political strategy of managed visibility, where the desired image of a closed and controlled border is prioritized over the messy, uncomfortable truth of human suffering being documented by impartial third parties. Mexico's calculus, particularly under its new presidency, is equally driven by a desire to assert strong national sovereignty and a pragmatic need to avoid economic warfare with its powerful northern neighbor. President Sheinbaum has consistently drawn a firm line against direct military intervention by the U.S. on Mexican soil, viewing it as a gross violation of sovereignty. Yet she has demonstrated a calculated willingness to cooperate extensively on migration enforcement and cartel figures extradition. The expulsion of foreign observers can be interpreted as a dual strategy, a concession to the U.S. imperative for operational secrecy that secures diplomatic and economic stability, avoiding the imposition of new tariffs, while simultaneously bolstering a domestic narrative that the government is firmly in charge of its own territory and internal security matters, free from the perceived meddling of foreign nonprofit entities. Furthermore, the expansion of military deployments on both sides contributes to the militarization of the border, a development that inherently favors limited transparency. The U.S. has expanded its military footprint in new national defense areas near the border, and Mexico continues to deploy thousands of soldiers for immigration enforcement. In a military-controlled operational zone, independent civilian oversight, especially from foreign-funded groups, is inherently viewed as a threat to mission security and effectiveness. This joint action solidifies the transformation of the border from an immigration issue into a primary national security theater, a framing that institutionally justifies the drastic reduction of civilian and humanitarian oversight as a regrettable but necessary step for the collective security of both nations. Looking ahead, the long-term consequences of this expulsion for border management and international accountability are significant and potentially corrosive. The immediate effect is the establishment of a dangerous precedent that the U.S. and Mexico can, in mutual agreement, effectively firewall off a major international crisis zone from global scrutiny. This action seriously weakens the already tenuous position of international bodies, like the United Nations and the Organization of American States (OAS), in demanding access and transparency regarding human rights situations within sovereign territories, especially when faced with the combined political and economic power of the two countries involved. The vacuum left by the observers will likely be filled by bilateral government monitoring mechanisms, if any are established at all, which inherently lack the independence and critical distance necessary for genuine accountability. Any oversight body created and funded by the very governments it is meant to scrutinize will inevitably prioritize state interests over the rights of vulnerable individuals. This shift is less about improving monitoring and more about controlling the flow of information, ensuring that narratives of success in deterrence and enforcement remain dominant in the public sphere, uncontaminated by detailed accounts of suffering or illegality. This new operational reality places an extraordinary, almost impossible burden on independent journalists and local Mexican NGOs who remain in the border cities. They become the last, most vulnerable line of defense for truth and accountability, often facing heightened risks of harassment, intimidation, and violence from both state actors and the powerful criminal groups operating in the region. Their ability to report freely is crucial, yet severely constrained, turning their work into an act of dangerous defiance rather than routine documentation. The international community, now physically excluded, must rely entirely on these brave but exposed voices, significantly limiting the scope and impact of any subsequent advocacy or diplomatic pressure. Ultimately, the U.S. support for Mexico's expulsion of foreign observers marks a definitive and sobering inflection point in the U.S.-Mexico relationship, signaling a shift toward realpolitik dominated by hard security concerns and domestic political appeasement. It solidifies a policy direction where the universal rights of migrants and refugees are increasingly subordinated to the state's perceived need for absolute operational control and the imperative to stop the physical flow of people at any humanitarian cost. The challenge now for global civil society is how to break through the constructed diplomatic silence, ensuring that the stories of those marginalized and abused in the newly hidden border zones are still told, and that the fundamental principles of transparency and human dignity are not permanently surrendered to the political expediency of deterrence and security. The expulsions also directly impact the legal battles currently challenging the restrictive U.S. policies. Mexican human rights NGOs, like the Instituto para las Mujeres and Migration, ME, have been engaged in crucial constitutional challenges in Mexican courts, arguing that Mexico's role in facilitating U.S. policies, such as receiving non-Mexican deportees, violates its own laws and international obligations. The testimony and evidence gathered by the now expelled foreign observers were often instrumental in bolstering these legal cases, providing the essential, granular documentation of the impact of these policies on the ground. By removing these witnesses, the administrations effectively starve the legal opposition of its primary, immediate source of impartial data, making it exponentially harder to prove harm in court and challenge the legality of the joint enforcement regime. This calculated move to limit legal transparency is a powerful tool of policy perpetuation. It ensures that while the legal challenges may continue in the abstract, the practical evidentiary basis for overturning or modifying the border management apparatus becomes dangerously thin. The result is a regulatory environment where policy is insulated from the legal scrutiny it deserves, allowing the U.S. and Mexican governments to maintain controversial expulsion agreements with minimal interference. This strategic exclusion undermines the very notion of judicial oversight in a humanitarian crisis and grants unprecedented executive latitude in how the border is enforced. Furthermore, the void in independent oversight has direct financial implications for the entire operation. Historically, reports from foreign observers have often highlighted inefficiencies, corruption, and the misallocation of resources in border security and migrant processing facilities. Their absence makes it significantly easier for both the U.S. and Mexico to justify massive increases in appropriations for enforcement, such as the funds recently signed into law for immigration detention and removals, without having to prove transparently and externally how those funds are being spent and whether they lead to ethical or effective outcomes. This lack of scrutiny creates an environment ripe for further militarization and privatization of border functions, with less accountability for taxpayer dollars and greater profit incentives for security contractors. The diplomatic rhetoric surrounding the expulsion often casts the observers as agents of foreign interference, subtly appealing to nationalist sentiments on both sides of the border. In Mexico, this narrative reinforces the government's claim of sovereignty and resistance to external dictates, even as it cooperates closely with U.S. mandates. In the U.S., the move aligns with the political rhetoric that often portrays human rights groups as obstructionists who complicate security efforts. This calculated public relations framing transforms humanitarian concern into a political weapon, justifying the exclusion on the grounds of national unity and anti-foreign meddling, thereby silencing critics and consolidating public support for harsh enforcement measures. The true, lasting legacy of this decision will be the normalization of a militarized, opaque border zone. The expulsion of observers is not an isolated incident. It is a critical piece in a larger strategy to permanently redesign the U.S.-Mexico border, not as a complex international boundary requiring humanitarian compassion and legal due process, but as a hard, impenetrable defensive line. This strategy prioritizes immediate physical security and political optics over the long-term, foundational values of human rights and international cooperation. The world must recognize that the quiet endorsement from Washington has not just removed eyes from the border. It has actively co-signed the creation of a zone where the rules of accountability are being rewritten in favor of state power and perpetual silence. The atmosphere in the border towns immediately following the expulsion notice was heavy with a palpable sense of abandonment and escalating fear. Migrants, already exposed to the brutal cycle of crossing and expulsion, suddenly felt the loss of their fragile protection network. The familiar faces of the international aid workers, those who provided everything from legal advice to simple medical care and blankets, were gone, leaving the most vulnerable populations even more susceptible to the predation of cartels and the indifference of local authorities. This created a new, desperate wave of uncertainty, with rumors spreading through the shelters and camps, further paralyzing the migratory movement and trapping many in dangerous holding patterns. The silence of the cameras and the absent notebooks of the observers have created a powerful psychological advantage for the criminal elements. Cartels and smuggling networks, who previously operated under the minimal constraint of potential international exposure, now sense a wider, safer operational field. Kidnappings, extortion rackets, targeting families waiting for processing, and the trafficking of women and children become easier to execute with near impunity, knowing that the primary sources of external documentation have been systematically removed. This environment fundamentally changes the risk-reward calculus for criminal enterprises, making the human cost of the border-crossing journey exponentially higher and more brutal. Local Mexican organizations, while remaining committed, now face an extreme resource crunch and an exponential increase in the burden of work. They must absorb the duties previously handled by large international NGOs, from complex litigation coordination to direct, large-scale humanitarian aid, all while operating with significantly fewer resources and under increased threats. Their capacity to act as the primary watchdogs is severely limited by their small size and vulnerability, underscoring the irreversible damage done by removing the larger, internationally backed organizations, whose very presence offered a degree of security through diplomatic visibility. The expulsion is also a clear message to future international cooperation efforts worldwide, that powerful nations, when motivated by domestic political imperatives, can effectively bypass global humanitarian standards in zones they deem critical to national security. This precedent could be leveraged by other nations facing sensitive border issues or internal conflicts, potentially leading to a global regression in the standards of governmental transparency and human rights protection. The U.S. support, therefore, is not just a tactical decision for the Mexico border. It is a philosophical endorsement of a restrictive, state-centric view of sovereignty that actively excludes the global community from witnessing humanitarian crises. The task of reconstructing accountability in this opaque environment falls heavily on legislative and congressional oversight. Yet even this avenue is compromised by the polarized political landscape. Without independent accounts from the field, legislators rely primarily on data provided by the executive branch agencies DHS, CBP, which often present a highly curated view of operations. This creates a loop of self-referential reporting, making it difficult for even well-intentioned oversight bodies to uncover systemic issues or verify claims of abuse. The only way forward for genuine transparency is sustained, rigorous investigative journalism, and concerted pressure from civil society to force the creation of genuinely independent, non-governmental monitoring access, or to compel internal government whistleblowers to expose the truth thriving in the engineered darkness of the newly secured border zone. The silence must be broken, or the human cost will be incalculable and permanently hidden from history. The removal of foreign observers marks the final stage of hardening the entire border infrastructure, extending beyond the mere construction of physical barriers to the creation of an invisible, bureaucratic wall. This unseen barrier is designed to repel not just migrants, but information, scrutiny, and accountability, thereby ensuring that the full scope of enforcement actions, including any controversial or inhumane practices, remains shielded from external view. The psychological impact of this policy on the agents working the border is also profound, subtly shifting the operational culture from one of constrained enforcement to one of unchecked authority, fostering an environment where discretion and due process can be easily sidelined in the name of mission efficiency.